I never thought a simple question about inheritance laws would unravel 20 years of lies and reveal just how calculating my daughter-in-law really was. What started as me asking supposedly stupid questions ended with me asking my attorney one very smart question that changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret, and at 72, I thought I had figured out most of life's mysteries. I'd raised 3 children as a single mother, after my husband David passed away when I was just 45. My oldest son, Michael, had always been my pride and joy, the responsible one who called every Sunday and never forgot my birthday. When he married Jessica 8 years ago, I genuinely believed I was gaining not just a daughter-in-law, but a true daughter. Jessica was everything Michael wasn't: confident where he was gentle, assertive where he was thoughtful, ambitious where he was content. She had this way of walking into a room and immediately taking charge, reorganizing things, making suggestions, always with a bright smile and the kind of energy that made you feel like maybe you really did need her help. At first, I found it refreshing. Michael had always been such a quiet soul, and Jessica seemed to bring out a more decisive side of him. The first red flag should have been how quickly she began asking questions about my financial situation. Not directly, of course. Jessica was far too clever for that. Instead, she'd make casual observations during family dinners at my house in Riverside Heights, a neighborhood I'd called home for 30 years. She'd comment on how well maintained my garden was, asking if I hired help. When I mentioned I did most of the work myself, she'd laugh and say something like, "Oh, Margaret, you're so independent, but you know, at your age, you really shouldn't be climbing ladders to trim those rose bushes. What if something happened?" Then came the questions about my late husband's pension, disguised as concern for my well-being. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable, Margaret. Michael worries about you being alone in this big house. Have you thought about what you'd do if you needed care someday?" She'd tilt her head with what seemed like genuine worry, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her coffee cup. I should have trusted my instincts then. Something about the way her eyes would scan my living room, taking inventory of the antique furniture David and I had collected over the years. The original artwork we'd bought during our travels, the crystal collection that had been my grandmother. She wasn't admiring these things, she was appraising them, but Michael seemed so happy with her, and after years of watching him struggle with confidence, seeing him with someone who believed in him felt like a gift. When they announced they were trying for a baby, I was overjoyed. When Jessica suffered 2 miscarriages, my heart broke for them both. When she finally carried little Emma to term 3 years ago, I felt like our family was complete. That's when things really began to change. Jessica's questions became more frequent and more specific. During one of our weekly coffee dates at the small cafe downtown, where we'd started meeting after Emma was born, she brought up estate planning with the kind of casual tone most people use to discuss the weather. "You know, Margaret, Michael and I were just talking about how important it is to have everything in order, especially with Emma now. Have you updated your will recently?" She stirred her latte slowly, not quite meeting my eye. "I mean, I know it's morbid to think about, but we want to make sure Emma's future is secure." I told her honestly that yes, I'd updated my will 2 years prior, making Michael the primary beneficiary of my estate, which included the house, my savings, and David's life insurance policy that had grown considerably over the year. Jessica nodded approvingly, but then asked what I thought was an odd follow-up question. "And what happens if something were to happen to Michael? I mean, God forbid, but you know how dangerous his commute is on Highway 95 every day. Have you thought about secondary beneficiaries?" The question caught me off guard. Michael worked as a software engineer for a tech company about 40 minutes away, and while the highway could be busy, I'd never considered it particularly dangerous. But Jessica's concern seemed genuine, and she was right that unexpected things could happen. I admitted I hadn't really thought through all the contingencies. "Well," she said, leaning forward slightly, "you might want to consider making Emma a secondary beneficiary, or even me, since I'd be the one taking care of her if anything happened to Michael. Just something to think about. At the time, it seemed like a reasonable suggestion from a concerned daughter-in-law and mother. Looking back, I realize it was the first move in a very calculated game. Over the following months, Jessica's involvement in my financial affairs intensified. She began accompanying Michael on his visits to my house, which had previously been our special father-son time. During these visits, she'd make herself busy organizing my paperwork, claiming she wanted to help me stay on top of things. "Margaret, you have so many investment statements and insurance documents scattered around. Why don't you let me help you create a filing system? I'm really good at organization." Before I could object, she'd already started sorting through the papers on my kitchen table, asking questions about each account, each policy, each certificate of deposit. She had this way of making her nosiness seem like kindness. When she found my safe deposit box key, she suggested I should give Michael a copy just in case of emergency. When she discovered I still had David's old business partnership agreements from 20 years ago, she recommended I have them reviewed by an attorney to make sure they wouldn't complicate my estate. "You're asking such smart questions, Jessica," I told her one afternoon as she helped me organize my financial documents into labeled folders. "I never would have thought of half these things." She smiled that bright, confident smile of hers. "Oh, these aren't smart questions, Marg. These are just common sense. The smart questions would be much more complicated. You don't need to worry about those." Her words stuck with me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why they bothered me. There was something dismissive in her tone, as if she was patting me on the head like a child who'd managed to tie her own shoes. The real turning point came 6 months ago, during what should have been a celebration. Michael had just received a promotion at work, and Jessica had suggested we all go out to dinner at Ocean View, an upscale seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. It was the kind of place David and I used to go for anniversaries, the kind of place where dinner for 4 could easily cost $300. Throughout the meal, Jessica was unusually animated, talking about their plans for the future, how they wanted to buy a bigger house, maybe take Emma to Europe when she was older. She kept mentioning how grateful they were for my support, both emotional and financial, though I wasn't sure what financial support she was referring to. I'd helped with Emma's daycare costs a few times when money was tight, but nothing substantial. Then, as we were waiting for dessert, Jessica's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and frowned. "It's my attorney," she said, which surprised me because I hadn't known she had an attorney. "I'm sorry, but I really need to take this. It's about some paperwork we've been waiting for." She stepped away from the table, and I watched through the window as she paced back and forth on the restaurant's deck, gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Michael seemed unconcerned, playing peekaboo with Emma, but something about Jessica's body language made me uneasy. When she returned, her demeanor had shifted completely. Gone was the celebratory mood, replaced by a tension I couldn't identify. "Everything okay?" Michael asked. "Fine," she said quickly. "Just some complications with the contracts we discussed. Nothing that can't be handled." The rest of the dinner passed awkwardly, with Jessica frequently checking her phone and giving short responses to our attempts at conversation. When the check came, she insisted on paying, pulling out a credit card I'd never seen before. "It's the least we can do," she said, though her smile seemed forced. "After all, we're family, we take care of each other." Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened, though I had no idea. Jessica's phone call, her sudden mood change, her comment about being family taking care of each other. It all felt connected to something I wasn't seeing. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I began to understand what I'd witnessed at that dinner. I'd gone to my mailbox on a Tuesday morning to find an envelope from my bank marked important account information. Inside was a notice that my savings account, which had contained nearly $60,000, had been accessed for a large withdrawal. The notice indicated that a secondary account holder had initiated the transaction. I stared at the paper in confusion. I had never added a secondary account holder to that account. David had been the only other person with access, and he'd been gone for over 25 years. I called the bank immediately, certain there had been some mistake. "Mrs. Patterson," the customer service representative said after I'd explained the situation. I'm showing here that Jessica Patterson was added as a joint account holder 3 months ago. The documentation shows your signature authorizing the change. My blood went cold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. That's impossible. I never signed anything like that. Ma'am, I have the paperwork right here. Your signature is notarized and everything appears to be in order. Miss Jessica Patterson withdrew $45,000 last week, using her authorization as a joint account holder. $45,000, the exact amount Jessica had just spent on a new Mercedes SUV that she'd claimed Michael's promotion had allowed them to afford. I hung up the phone with shaking hands and immediately called Michael at work. Mom, what's wrong? You sound upset. I explained what I'd discovered, trying to keep my voice steady. There had to be some explanation. Maybe Jessica had mentioned needing to access my account for some reason, and I'd forgotten. Maybe there was paperwork I'd signed without fully understanding what it was. That's impossible, Michael said, and for a moment I felt relief. Jessica would never do something like that without asking you first. There must be some mistake. Can you ask her about it? Maybe she can explain what happened. Of course, I'll call her right now and get this sorted out. Don't worry, Mom. There's got to be a simple explanation. But when Michael called me back an hour later, his tone had changed completely. Mom, I talked to Jessica. She says she did add herself to your account, but only because you asked her to. She says you were worried about managing your finances and wanted her to help. She says you specifically told her she could use the money for our family's needs, since it would all come to us eventually anyway. The words hit me like a physical blow. Michael, I never said any such thing. I would never give anyone access to my accounts without discussing it with you first. Mom, Jessica wouldn't lie about something like this. Maybe you just forgot. You've been under a lot of stress lately. And sometimes, he trailed off. But I knew what he was implying. Sometimes older people forget things. Sometimes they get confused about what they've said or done. I am not confused, Michael. I did not give Jessica permission to access my money. She forged my signature. That's a very serious accusation, Mom. Are you absolutely certain? Because if you're wrong, the doubt in his voice was like a knife twisting in my chest. My own son was questioning my memory, my judgment, my honesty, because his wife had told him to. I want you to ask Jessica to show you the paperwork she claims I signed. I want to see it myself. Okay, I'll ask her. But Mom, please don't jump to conclusions. Jessica loves you. She would never deliberately hurt you. That evening, Michael came to my house with a folder of documents. Jessica wasn't with him, which I found telling. She had to stay home with Emma, he explained, though Emma often came with them for visits. But she sent all the paperwork you wanted to see. The signature on the bank authorization form was mine, or rather, it was an extremely good forgery of mine. Someone had clearly practiced reproducing my handwriting, and they'd done it well enough to fool a notary. But I knew my own signature, knew the particular way I formed my letters, the pressure I applied, the slight tremor that had developed in my right hand over the past few years. This signature was too smooth, too confident, too perfect. This isn't my signature, Mike. He examined the document carefully, and I could see uncertainty flickering in his eyes. It looks like your signature to me, Mom. Look closer. See how the M in Margaret is formed? I always make that little hook at the top because of my arthritis. And the P in Patterson, look at how straight those lines are. My hands shake now, Michael. They have for 3 years. You've seen me sign birthday cards, Christmas checks. You know how my writing looks. Michael studied the signature for a long time, and I watched his face as understanding began to dawn. When he looked up at me, his expression was troubled. What are you saying, Mom? I'm saying your wife forged my signature to steal my money, and I'm saying she's been planning this for months, maybe years. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael set the papers down on my coffee table and rubbed his face with both hands. This can't be happening, he whispered. I need you to ask yourself something, Michael. When did Jessica first start asking questions about my finances? When did she start suggesting changes to my will? When did she start involving herself in my personal business? As I spoke, I watched the realization wash over his face. All those helpful suggestions, all those concerned questions, all that organizational assistance, it hadn't been kindness, it had been reconnaissance. What am I supposed to do with this information, Mom? She's my wife, she's Emma's mother. You're supposed to demand that she return my money and never access my accounts again, and you're supposed to ask yourself what else she might have done that you don't know about. Michael left that night without making any promises, and I didn't hear from either of them for 3 days. When Jessica finally called, her tone was completely different from the sweet, concerned voice I'd grown accustomed to. Margaret, I think there's been a misunderstanding. Michael is very upset, and frankly, I think you're causing unnecessary drama over what was clearly a family decision. There was no family decision, Jessica. You stole my money. I didn't steal anything. That money was always going to come to our family eventually. I just accessed it a little early to help us get established. Isn't that what grandparents do? Help their children and grandchildren? The casual entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. She genuinely seemed to believe that my money was already hers, that my death was simply an inconvenient delay in her inheritance. That money is mine until I decide otherwise, Jessica, and I certainly didn't decide to fund your new car. Look, Margaret, I understand you're upset, but let's think about this rationally. If you make a big deal out of this, it's going to cause problems for everyone. Michael could lose his job if this becomes a legal issue. Emma could be affected. Is that really what you want? The threat was subtle but clear. If I pursued this, there would be consequences for my family. Jessica was counting on my love for Michael and Emma to keep me quiet. I want my money returned, Jessica. All of it. That's not possible right now. We've already made commitments based on that funding, but I'll tell you what, I'm willing to discuss a repayment plan, maybe a few $100s a month until it's paid back, a few $100s a month. At that rate, it would take her 15 years to repay what she'd stolen, assuming she actually made the payments. That's not acceptable. Well, then I guess we have a problem, because those are my terms, take it or leave it. After she hung up, I sat in my living room, staring at the phone, trying to process what had just happened. My daughter-in-law had stolen my money, threatened my family, and offered to pay it back at a rate that would benefit her far more than me. And she'd done it all with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd never doubted she'd get away with it. That's when I realized something that chilled me to the bone. Jessica hadn't just decided one day to steal from me. She'd been planning this from the beginning. All those questions about my finances, all that help organizing my paperwork, all those suggestions about my will, it had all been preparation for this moment. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done months earlier. I called my attorney. Helen Morrison had been handling my legal affairs for 15 years, ever since David's estate had been settled. She was sharp, experienced, and had a reputation for not suffering fools gladly. When I explained what had happened, her response was immediate and decisive. Margaret, this is fraud. Clear, simple fraud. We need to act quickly to protect your remaining assets and pursue criminal charges. But Helen, it's my son's wife. If I press charges, it could destroy my relationship with my family. And if you don't press charges, what message does that send? That she can steal from you whenever she wants, that your family can take advantage of you without consequences. Helen was right, but the emotional cost felt overwhelming. How do you send your daughter-in-law to jail? How do you explain to your granddaughter that her mother is a criminal? How do you live with the knowledge that your pursuit of justice might cost you the people you love most? I need time to think about this, I told Helen. Don't take too long. The longer we wait, the harder it becomes to recover your money and prove your case. That weekend, Michael came to visit alone again. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't been sleeping well. Mom, Jessica and I have been talking. She admits she made a mistake in the way she handled the account situation. She's willing to set up a payment plan to give you back the money. She offered me that plan already. Michael, a few $100s a month for the next 15 years. That's not making amends. That's adding insult to injury. What do you want her to do? She can't just come up with $45,000 overnight. She managed to spend it overnight on a car she didn't need. Michael slumped into his father's old armchair, the one by the window where David used to read his morning paper. Seeing him there, looking so defeated, broke my heart. I don't know what to do, Mom. If this becomes a legal thing, it could affect my job. Jessica's talking about taking Emma and moving back to her mother's in Portland. I could lose everything. And there it was, Jessica's real strategy. She wasn't just threatening consequences, she was threatening to take away the two things that mattered most to Michael, his career and his daughter. She'd positioned herself as the victim, the misunderstood wife, whose controlling mother-in-law was trying to destroy their family over money. Michael, I need you to understand something. This isn't about the money, not really. This is about the fact that your wife has been lying to us for years, planning to take advantage of me, and now that she's been caught, she's trying to manipulate you into choosing between her and me. I know, Mom, I know, but what choice do I have? I can't lose Emma. Watching my son torn between loyalty to me and fear of losing his daughter was one of the most painful moments of my life. Jessica had crafted the perfect trap, using his love for Emma as leverage to protect herself from the consequences of her actions. But that night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something important. Jessica's confidence in her strategy was also her weakness. She believed she'd thought of everything, covered all the angles, anticipated every possible response, but there was one question she hadn't expected me to ask, one possibility she hadn't prepared for. The next morning, I called Helen Morrison again. Helen, I have a question for you. A smart question, I hope. I'm listening. If Jessica forged my signature to access my bank account, and if she's been systematically gathering information about my finances for years, what are the chances this is the only crime she's committed? There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's a very smart question indeed, Margaret. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Jessica is too careful, too thorough to have put all her eggs in one basket. If she was planning to steal from me, she probably had backup plans, other accounts, other documents, other ways to access my assets. You want me to conduct a comprehensive audit of your financial situation. I want you to find out everything Jessica has been doing behind my back. And Helen, I want you to do it quietly. If I'm right about this, I don't want her to know we're investigating until we have all the evidence. Consider it done. But Margaret, if we find what I think we're going to find, there won't be any going back. This won't be a family dispute anymore. It'll be a criminal case. Then that's what it'll be, because I'm done being the naive old woman who asks stupid questions. It's time to start asking the smart ones. As I hung up the phone, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, a sense of control. For too long, I'd been reacting to Jessica's moves, responding to her manipulations, playing defense in a game where I didn't even know the rules. But now I was ready to play offense. Jessica thought she was smarter than me, thought she could exploit my love for my family to get away with theft. She'd counted on my asking the obvious questions, the emotional questions, the questions that would lead to family drama and hurt feelings and ultimately, her getting what she wanted. But she'd never expected me to ask the one question that mattered most. What else have you done? Over the next few days, I watched Jessica carefully during family interactions, looking for signs of nervousness or concern, but she seemed completely confident, even cheerful, as if the matter of my stolen money was already resolved in her favor. She brought Emma for a visit, chatting about their vacation plans, and Emma's upcoming birthday party as if nothing had changed between us. You know, Margaret, she said as Emma played in my garden, I really think this whole bank thing was just a communication breakdown. Families have these misunderstandings sometimes. The important thing is that we're working through it together. She was so certain she'd won, so convinced that her threats about Michael's job and access to Emma had neutralized any real consequences for her actions. Watching her smugness, her casual dismissal of what she'd done to me, I felt my resolve strengthen. You're right, Jessica. Communication is very important in families. It's also important in legal proceedings. Something flickered in her eyes for just a moment, but she recovered quickly. Legal proceedings? Margaret, Surely you're not still thinking about involving lawyers over a simple family matter. Oh, I've already involved my lawyer. She's been very helpful in answering my questions. What kind of questions? And there it was, the first crack in her confidence. She was trying to sound casual, but I could hear the tension in her voice. Smart questions, Jessica. The kind you said I didn't need to worry about. After they left that afternoon, I realized I'd learned something important. Jessica wasn't quite as confident as she pretended to be. She was worried about something beyond the bank account she'd already accessed, which meant Helen was right to look deeper. The call came 3 days later. Helen's voice was grim but satisfied. Margaret, you need to come to my office. We need to talk about what I've found, and it's not a conversation for the phone. When I arrived at Helen's office the following morning, she had a thick folder waiting on her desk. How much do you know about Jessica's background? She asked without preamble. Not much, really. She met Michael at a conference, worked in marketing for some tech company. She doesn't talk much about her family. That's because her family is very interesting. Jessica Patterson Nee Williams has been married before. Twice, actually. I felt my stomach drop. Michael doesn't know that. I'm sure he doesn't. Both previous marriages ended with her being accused of financial impropriety. The first husband, an elderly widower named Robert Chen, died under suspicious circumstances after naming Jessica as his primary beneficiary. No charges were filed, but his children contested the will. And the second husband, Marcus Thompson, a software engineer very similar to Michael actually. He caught Jessica embezzling from his business account. They divorced, but he didn't pursue criminal charges in exchange for her agreeing to leave the state. Helen opened the folder and pulled out a photograph. This is Jessica Williams Thompson Patterson. She's been using variations of this scheme for at least 8 years. The photograph showed Jessica, but her hair was different, her style more conservative. She looked younger, more innocent. It was the same face, but it belonged to a stranger. Helen, what are you telling me? I'm telling you that your daughter-in-law is a professional con artist who specializes in targeting older people with assets, usually through family connection. She researches her marks carefully, ingratiates herself into their lives, gains access to their financial information, and then systematically loots their accounts. The room seemed to spin around me, but she has a child with Michael. She's been with him for 8 years, and she's been working this con for 8 years. Margaret, Emma may not even be Michael's biological child. Jessica has used pregnancy and children as tools before to create emotional leverage and prevent her victims from pursuing legal action. I gripped the arms of my chair, trying to process what Helen was telling me. Everything I thought I knew about Jessica, about my family, about the last 8 years of my life, was a lie. There's more, Helen continued. Based on the financial records I've been able to access, Jessica has been systematically transferring money from various accounts connected to your family. Not just the savings account she accessed with the forged signature. She's been skimming smaller amounts from multiple sources for years. How much? Conservatively. Over $200,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. $200,000, nearly a third of my total assets. Gone. Stolen by someone I'd trusted, someone I'd welcomed into my family, someone I'd loved like a daughter. But that's not the worst part, Helen said quietly. Margaret, I need you to look at this. She handed me another document, this one bearing the letterhead of my insurance company. It was a beneficiary change form for my life insurance policy, dated 6 months ago. According to the form, I had removed Michael as my primary beneficiary and replaced him with Jessica Patterson. I stared at the document in disbelief. I never signed this. I know, the signature analysis confirms it's another forgery. But Margaret, this tells us something very important about Jessica's timeline. What do you mean? I mean she's not planning to wait for you to die naturally. The pattern of her previous victims, the escalation of her thefts from your accounts, the life insurance beneficiary change. It all suggests she's moving into the final phase of her operation. Helen's words hung in the air like a death sentence. My daughter-in-law wasn't just stealing my money, she was positioning herself to benefit from my death. And based on her history, she might not be willing to wait for nature to take its course. What do I do? We call the police. Today, right now. And we get you into protective custody until Jessica can be arrested. As Helen reached for her phone, I realized that Jessica had been right about one thing. I had been asking stupid questions. Questions about family loyalty, about forgiveness, about keeping the peace. The smart question, the one that mattered, was much simpler. How do I stay alive long enough to see justice done? The police station felt like another world entirely. Detective Sarah Chen, a woman about Jessica's age with sharp eyes and an efficient manner, led me through a maze of corridors to a small interview room that smelled of stale coffee and anxiety. Helen sat beside me, her briefcase full of evidence that would either save my life or destroy what remained of my family. Mrs. Patterson, Detective Chen began, spreading the documents across the metal table. These are very serious allegations. Before we proceed, I need you to understand that once we begin this investigation, there's no going back. Your daughter-in-law will be arrested, your son will likely be questioned, and your family dynamics will be permanently altered. I looked at the forged signatures, the insurance documents, the bank records showing Jessica's systematic theft. Detective, my family dynamics were altered the moment Jessica decided to steal from me. I just didn't know it at the time. Helen opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder. Detective Chen, there's something else you need to see. We've uncovered evidence that Jessica Patterson has done this before, multiple times with multiple victims. As Helen laid out Jessica's history, her pattern of targeting vulnerable older people, her string of aliases and false identities, I felt a strange mix of vindication and horror. Vindication because it proved I wasn't a paranoid old woman imagining things. Horror because it meant I'd been living with a predator for 8 years, trusting her with my grandson, welcoming her into my home. The pattern is consistent, Helen explained. She identifies targets through family connections, usually older individuals with substantial assets but limited family support. She ingratiates herself into their lives, gains access to their financial information, and then begins systematic theft, while positioning herself to inherit everything upon their death. Detective Chen studied the photographs of Jessica's previous victims. What happened to these other people? Robert Chen died of apparent heart failure 6 months after naming Jessica as his beneficiary. The death was ruled natural, but his children suspected foul play. They couldn't prove anything, but Jessica disappeared immediately after probate closed, taking nearly $400,000 with her. And the second victim, Marcus Thompson, caught her embezzling before she could complete her scheme. She agreed to leave the state rather than face prosecution, but by then she'd already stolen over $100,000 from his business accounts. Detective Chen turned to me. Mrs. Patterson, have you experienced any unusual health issues recently? Unexplained illnesses, dizzy spells, anything that might seem suspicious in retrospect? The question sent a chill down my spine. I've been more tired lately and I've had some stomach problems, but I assumed it was just stress from everything that's been happening. When did these symptoms start? I thought back over the past few months, trying to pinpoint when I'd first noticed feeling unwell. About 3 months ago, right around the time Jessica started bringing me those herbal teas she said would help with my arthritis. Detective Chen and Helen exchanged glances. Mrs. Patterson, we're going to need you to see a doctor immediately. We need blood work to test for any unusual substances in your system. The implications of what she was suggesting hit me like a freight train. Jessica hadn't just been stealing my money, she'd been slowly poisoning me. She's been in my house almost every day, I whispered. She brings me food, makes my coffee, organizes my medications. She's had access to everything. Which is why we need to get you somewhere safe right now, Detective Chen said. Is there somewhere you can stay where Jessica won't think to look for you? Helen pulled out her phone. I have a client who runs a private security company. They have safe houses for situations like this. As Helen made arrangements for my protection, Detective Chen continued her questioning. Mrs. Patterson, I need you to think carefully about your interactions with Jessica over the past few months. Has she asked unusual questions about your daily routine? Has she encouraged you to change any of your habits or medications? Now that I was looking for them, the signs were everywhere. Jessica's insistence that I switch to a new pharmacy that was more convenient for her to pick up my prescription. Her suggestion that I start taking vitamin supplements she'd researched specifically for women my age. Her constant offers to help with my cooking, always wanting to add ingredients or spices she claimed would be better for my health. She's been controlling everything I put in my body for months, I realized aloud, and I thanked her for it. I told her how thoughtful she was. This is exactly how she operated with her previous victims, Helen said grimly. Slow, systematic poisoning designed to look like natural age-related decline. By the time anyone becomes suspicious, the victim is either dead or too incapacitated to defend themselves. Detective Chen closed her notebook. Mrs. Patterson, we're going to arrest Jessica tonight. We have enough evidence for fraud charges, and once we get your blood work back, we may be adding attempted murder to the list. The safe house was a modest apartment in a complex 40 minutes outside the city, furnished with generic furniture and stocked with basic necessities. The security consultant, a former police officer named David Reeves, showed me how to use the communication system and explained the protocols for my protection. You're not to contact anyone from your family directly, he emphasized. All communication goes through Detective Chen, or your attorney. We can't risk Jessica learning your location. That first night alone in the safe house was the longest of my life. I'd gone from being a grandmother who baked cookies and tended her garden to a protected witness hiding from a woman who'd been slowly murdering me while pretending to love my family. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional sound of other residents in the building and the distant hum of traffic. I called Helen on the secure phone line she'd provided. Any word from Detective Chen? Jessica was arrested 3 hours ago. She's being held without bail due to flight risk concerns. But Margaret, there's something else. Michael doesn't believe the charges. He's hired an attorney for Jessica and is claiming you're having some kind of mental breakdown. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Jessica had done to me. My own son, presented with evidence that his wife was a serial killer, had chosen to believe her over me. What about Emma? Is she safe? She's with Michael. Child Services has been notified, but unless we can prove Jessica poses a direct threat to the child, they won't intervene. Michael is convinced this is all a misunderstanding, that you're being manipulated by unscrupulous lawyers looking to cause family drama. I sank into the safe house's uncomfortable couch, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. In trying to protect myself, I'd lost my son and possibly my granddaughter. Jessica's final manipulation was turning out to be her most effective, convincing Michael that I was the real villain in this story. Helen, what if Michael is right? What if I am losing my mind? What if I've misinterpreted everything and Jessica really was just trying to help? Margaret, stop. The blood work came back an hour ago. You have significant levels of digitalis in your system, a heart medication that can be fatal in large doses. Jessica has been poisoning you for months, probably hoping to trigger a heart attack that would look natural given your age. Digitalis. I'd heard of it before, a medication derived from foxglove plants. In therapeutic doses it could treat heart conditions. In larger amounts, it was deadly, causing exactly the kind of gradual decline Jessica had been encouraging me to accept as normal aging. How long do I have to stay here? Until the trial potential. Jessica's attorney is arguing that the evidence against her was obtained illegally, that you're an unreliable witness due to cognitive decline, and that the whole case is based on family disputes rather than actual crime. Over the following days, I learned more about Jessica's defense strategy through Helen's updates. She was portraying herself as a devoted daughter-in-law who'd been trying to help an increasingly difficult and paranoid elderly woman. The financial irregularities were explained as authorized assistance that I'd later forgotten due to memory problems. The forged signatures were dismissed as normal variations in my handwriting caused by arthritis and medication effects. Most devastatingly, she was using my own son as a character witness, having him testify about my recent behavioral changes, my increased suspicion and paranoia, my unreasonable accusations against a woman who'd done nothing but try to care for me. She's very good at this, Helen admitted during one of our calls. She's had years to perfect her victim persona, and she's chosen her witnesses carefully. Michael genuinely believes he's protecting his wife from a confused old woman's false accusation. Can we prove the digitalus poisoning wasn't accidental? That's the challenge. Jessica is claiming she was giving you herbal supplements on the advice of a naturopathic doctor, and that any medication in your system must have come from some other source. She's even suggesting that you might have accidentally overdosed yourself by taking extra pills when you forgot you'd already taken your daily dose. The genius of Jessica's approach was becoming clear. She'd spent months establishing a narrative of my declining mental state, my forgetfulness, my increasing dependence on her help. Now, when confronted with evidence of her crimes, she could use that same narrative to explain away everything, as the confused perceptions of an elderly woman who couldn't be trusted to remember her own actions. Detective Chen visited me at the safe house after Jessica's bail hearing. Despite the flight risk concerns and the severity of the charges, Jessica's attorney had managed to get her released to Michael's custody with electronic monitoring. She's not allowed to leave the county, and she can't contact you directly, Detective Chen explained. But Miss Patterson, I need you to know that she's been making statements to the media, giving interviews about elder abuse and how families can be torn apart by greedy lawyers who convince vulnerable seniors to turn against their loved one. I turned on the television that night and found Jessica on the local news, looking perfectly composed and heartbroken, as she spoke to a sympathetic reporter. Margaret has been like a mother to me, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. I've spent 8 years caring for her, helping her manage her finances, making sure she was safe and comfortable. To be accused of stealing from her, of trying to hurt her, it's devastating. I think she's been influenced by people who don't have her best interests at heart, people who saw an opportunity to create conflict where none existed. The reporter nodded sympathetically. What do you say to those who claim there's evidence of financial fraud? I say, look at the source. Margaret has been showing signs of confusion for months. She forgets conversations we've had, misplaces important documents, sometimes doesn't remember giving me permission to help with her banking. Her attorney is taking advantage of an elderly woman's vulnerability to create a sensational case that will generate publicity and fees. Watching Jessica perform for the cameras, I marveled at her skill. She appeared genuine, wounded, confused by accusations that seemed to come from nowhere. If I hadn't known the truth, if I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes, I might have believed her myself. The interview continued with Jessica describing our close relationship, her devotion to my well-being, her shock at being arrested for trying to help. She painted a picture of a loving family torn apart by outside influences, with me as the confused elderly victim of unscrupulous legal manipulation. All I ever wanted was to take care of Margaret and make sure she was safe, Jessica concluded. If helping an elderly family member with their finances is now considered a crime, then no family is safe from this kind of persecution. The segment ended with the reporter's commentary about the complexities of elder care and the fine line between assistance and exploitation. The implication was clear. This was probably a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by lawyers looking to profit from family dysfunction. Helen called within minutes of the broadcast ending. Margaret, Jessica's media strategy is working. Public opinion is turning in her favor, and that's going to influence potential jurors. We need to be prepared for a long fight. What about Michael? Has he seen the evidence? He's seen it, but Jessica's attorney is claiming it's all circumstantial. The forged signatures could be explained by natural variations in your handwriting. The bank withdrawals were authorized by documents you signed, even if you don't remember signing them. The digilus could have come from anywhere, including accidental overdose of your own medication. I felt trapped in a nightmare where truth had become subjective, where documented evidence could be dismissed as misunderstanding, where a woman who'd been systematically murdering me could present herself as the real victim. Helen, what if she gets away with it? What if the jury believes her story? Then she'll disappear, probably within hours of an acquittal. She'll take whatever assets she's managed to steal, abandon Michael and Emma, and start over somewhere else with a new identity. The thought of Jessica walking free while I remained in hiding, of her abandoning Emma after using her as a prop in her con game, of Michael eventually learning the truth when it was too late to matter,
filled me with a determination I hadn't felt since this nightmare began. I want to testify. I want to face her in court and tell my story. Margaret, that's risky. Her attorney will attack your credibility, your memory, your mental state. It could backfire spectacularly, maybe, but right now the only person defending me is you. Jessica has Michael, she has public sympathy, she has 8 years of carefully constructed lies to support her story. All I have is the truth, and if I don't tell it myself, who will? 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled to begin, I received an unexpected call from Detective Chen. Miss Patterson, we may have caught a break. Jessica's electronic monitoring device recorded her visiting an internet cafe yesterday, and our tech team was able to recover her browsing history. What did she look up? Flight schedules to countries without extradition treaties with the United States. She also researched new identity documents and offshore banking procedures. It looks like she's planning to run if the trial doesn't go her way. This information changed everything. If Jessica was planning to flee, it meant she wasn't as confident in her defense as she appeared. It also meant that Emma was in danger. Jessica wouldn't hesitate to abandon a child who'd outlived her usefulness. Detective, we need to get Emma away from her. We're working on it, but family court moves slowly. Michael still has custody rights, and he's not going to willingly give up his daughter based on what he sees as fabricated charges against his wife. That night, I made a decision that would either save my granddaughter or destroy what little remained of my relationship with my son. I called Michael directly, breaking every protocol David Reeves had established for my protection. "Mom, where are you? Are you okay?" Hearing his voice, the genuine concern mixed with confusion and pain, nearly broke my resolve. But I thought of Emma, innocent and trusting, living with a woman who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be discarded when convenient. "Michael, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Emma is in danger." "Mom, please, not this again." "Jessica loves Emma. She's been a wonderful mother." "Jessica has been planning to leave the country, Michael. The police have evidence that she's researching how to disappear with new identity documents. When she runs, she's not taking Emma with her. That's ridiculous. Jessica would never abandon Emma. Jessica abandoned her first husband when he died under suspicious circumstances. She abandoned her second husband when he caught her stealing. She's a professional con artist, Michael. Emma was never her daughter. She was her insurance policy. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought he'd hung up. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If any of what you're saying is true, then I've been living with a stranger for 8 years. I've let a dangerous person raise my daughter. I've chosen her over my own mother." "Michael, none of that matters now. What matters is getting Emma to safety before Jessica realizes her plan has been discovered." "What do you want me to do? Take Emma and leave tonight? Go to Helen's office, or the police station, or anywhere Jessica can't find you, but don't tell her where you're going, and don't give her a chance to stop you." Another long pause. "Mom, if I do this, if I take Emma and run, there's no going back. If you're wrong about Jessica, I'll have destroyed my marriage for nothing. If you're right, then my wife is a killer who's been slowly murdering my mother. I know what I'm asking of you, Michael, and I know how hard this is, but I'd rather you hate me for the rest of my life than spend it wondering if you could have saved Emma when you had the chance." The call ended without Michael making any promises, and I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life, or the most important decision I'd ever make. The answer came at 3 in the morning when my secure phone rang. It was Detective Chen. "Mrs. Patterson, your son just showed up at the police station with your granddaughter. He's asking for protective custody, and wants to know everything we can tell him about Jessica's background." Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I started crying. Michael had chosen to trust me to protect Emma, to face the horrible truth about the woman he'd married. "Is Emma okay?"
"She's fine." Confused and upset, but physically unharmed. Michael is, well, he's devastated. Learning that his wife is a serial killer who is slowly poisoning his mother tends to have that effect. "Can I see them?" "Tomorrow. We're arranging a secure location where you can reunite safely, but Mrs. Patterson, there's something else." When Michael left to come to the station, Jessica tried to stop him. She became violent, threatening, and dropped her victim persona completely. Michael recorded part of the confrontation on his phone before she realized what he was doing. What did she say? Among other things, she admitted that Emma wasn't his biological daughter, that she'd used the child to manipulate him from the beginning, and that he'd ruined everything by believing his crazy mother over her. She also threatened to kill you both if she ever got the chance. Jessica's mask had finally slipped completely. Faced with the collapse of her carefully constructed lie, she'd revealed the cold, calculating predator underneath. More importantly, she'd done it while being recorded, providing evidence that would be impossible for her attorney to explain away. Detective, what happens to Jessica now? Her bail is being revoked due to the threats against you and Michael. She'll be held in custody until trial, and with this new evidence, her attorney is probably going to start negotiating a plea deal. As I finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of the morning, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The truth was finally coming to light. My family was safe, and Jessica's reign of terror was ending. But I also knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Michael would have to process the fact that his marriage had been a lie, that Emma wasn't his biological daughter, that he'd been manipulated and used for years by someone he'd loved and trusted. Emma would have to grow up knowing that the woman she'd called mother had been a dangerous predator who'd never truly cared about her. The trial was still weeks away, and Jessica would undoubtedly continue fighting to maintain her innocence and portray herself as the victim. The media would continue debating whether this was justice or persecution, whether I was a vulnerable elder or a vindictive mother-in-law. But none of that mattered as much as the knowledge that my granddaughter was safe, that my son finally knew the truth, and that Jessica would never be able to hurt another family the way she'd hurt ours. Tomorrow, I would see Michael and Emma for the first time since this nightmare began. I would have to find words to explain the unexplainable, to help them understand how someone they'd loved and trusted had been systematically destroying our family for years. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about rebuilding after this kind of betrayal would be easy. But for the first time since that day in Helen's office when I'd learned the truth about Jessica, I believed that rebuilding was possible. The smart question I'd asked my attorney had led to more smart questions, and those had led to the truth. Sometimes the truth was ugly, painful, and devastating. But it was also the foundation upon which genuine healing could begin. As I finally fell asleep, I thought about the conversation I'd had with Jessica months ago, when she'd dismissed my concerns as stupid questions, and told me I didn't need to worry about the smart ones. She'd been wrong about that, just as she'd been wrong about so many things. The smartest question of all had been the simplest. What else have you done? And now, finally, I had my answer. The reunion with Michael and Emma took place in a conference room at the district attorney's office, chosen for its security and neutral atmosphere. When I walked through the door and saw my son holding my granddaughter, both of them looking lost and bewildered, my heart nearly shattered from the mix of relief and grief washing over me. Michael looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat appearance was disheveled, as if he'd forgotten how to take care of himself. Emma clung to him with the desperate grip of a child whose world had suddenly become unsafe and unpredictable. "Grandma Margaret." Emma broke away from Michael and ran to me, throwing her small arms around my waist. "Daddy says we can't go home. He says Mommy, Jessica did bad things. But that's not true, right? Mommy Jessica loves us." I knelt down to Emma's level, looking into her trusting brown eyes, and realized that this moment would define how she remembered this trauma for the rest of her life. The words I chose now would either help her heal, or add to her confusion and pain. "Sweetheart, sometimes grown-ups pretend to be someone they're not. Jessica pretended to love us, but she was really just trying to take things that didn't belong to her. It's not your fault, and it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you or Dad. It just means Jessica was very good at pretending." Emma's lower lip trembled, but she read me stories and made me pancakes and bought me pretty dresses. "I know she did. And those moments felt real to you because your feelings were real. But Jessica was doing those things to trick us, not because she truly cared about us." Michael's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "Mom, I owe you an apology that I'll probably spend the rest of my life trying to make up for. I chose to believe her over you. I actually thought you were losing your mind, becoming paranoid and vindictive. I let her convince me that you were the problem. I stood up and reached for my son's hand. Michael, Jessica is a professional manipulator. She's had years of practice making people believe exactly what she wants them to believe. You're not weak or stupid for falling for her act. You're human. But I should have known. There were signs, weren't there? Things that didn't add up. Inconsistencies in her stories. I ignored them because I wanted to believe that I'd found someone who truly loved me and wanted to build a life together. Detective Chen entered the room carrying a thick file folder. Mr. Patterson, Mrs. Patterson. I wanted to update you on where we stand with the case. Jessica's attorney has approached the district attorney about a plea bargain. What kind of plea bargain? Michael asked. She's willing to plead guilty to the financial fraud charges in exchange for the attempted murder charges being dropped to assault. She'd serve 8 to 12 years instead of potentially life in prison. I felt anger surge through me. 8 to 12 years for slowly poisoning me. For stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars, for planning to kill me and disappear with my money. The prosecutor wants to take it to trial, but he wanted you to know about the offer. The challenge is that proving attempted murder requires demonstrating intent, and Jessica's attorney is arguing that the digilus could have been accidental contamination from the herbal supplements she was giving you. Michael shook his head in disbelief. Even now she's still lying. Even with all the evidence, she's still trying to minimize what she did. There's something else, Detective Chen continued. We've been in contact with law enforcement in Oregon and California regarding Jessica's previous victim. They're reopening the investigation into Robert Chen's death. And Marcus Thompson has agreed to testify about his experiences with her. Over the following weeks, as we prepared for trial, more details about Jessica's past emerged. She'd been born Jennifer Williams in a small town in Nevada, the daughter of a con artist mother who'd taught her from childhood that other people existed to be exploited. Her real name wasn't even Jessica Patterson. It was one of at least 6 identities she'd used over the past 15 years. The trial preparation process was exhausting and emotionally devastating. I had to relive every moment of Jessica's manipulation. Every lie she'd told, every time she'd gained my trust only to use it against me. Michael had to confront the reality that his marriage had been a performance, that Emma wasn't his biological daughter, that everything he'd believed about his life for the past 8 years had been an elaborate fiction. Helen worked tirelessly to build our case, bringing in handwriting experts to analyze the forged signatures, financial analysts to trace Jessica's theft patterns, and medical experts to explain how the digilus poisoning had been carried out. The evidence was overwhelming, but Jessica's defense attorney was skilled at creating reasonable doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Jessica's attorney began during opening statements. This case is about a family tragedy that has been blown completely out of proportion by opportunistic lawyers and overzealous prosecutors. My client, Jessica Patterson, is not a criminal mastermind or a cold-blooded killer. She's a devoted wife and mother who made the mistake of trying to help an elderly family member who was struggling with the early stages of dementia. I watched Jessica during the opening statements, noting how she'd transformed her appearance for trial. Gone was the confident, polished woman who'd once organized my financial documents with such efficiency. In her place sat someone who looked fragile and bewildered, wearing conservative clothing and minimal makeup, projecting an image of innocence and vulnerability. Her attorney painted a picture of me as a confused elderly woman who'd forgotten giving Jessica permission to help with my finance, who'd become paranoid and suspicious due to cognitive decline, and who'd been manipulated by unscrupulous legal counsel into believing that family assistance was criminal fraud. Miss Hudson's own son will testify that his mother had been exhibiting signs of memory loss and confusion for months before these accusations surfaced. The attorney continued. The so-called evidence of forgery could easily be explained by natural variations in handwriting caused by arthritis and medication effects. The presence of digilus in her system is consistent with accidental overdose of her own heart medication,
not deliberate poisoning. When my turn came to testify, I felt the weight of 8 years of lies pressing down on me. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and Jessica's supporters who'd been convinced by her media campaign that she was the real victim. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Rivera, walked me through my relationship with Jessica, the gradual escalation of her financial involvement, and the discovery of her theft. I spoke clearly and calmly, sticking to facts and avoiding emotional appeals that Jessica's attorney could use to portray me as vindictive. Mrs. Patterson, Prosecutor Rivera asked, when you discovered that $45,000 had been withdrawn from your account, what was your immediate reaction? I was confused at first. I thought there had been some mistake. When I learned that Jessica had been added as a joint account holder, I assumed there was some explanation I wasn't aware of. What changed your mind? When I saw the signature authorizing the account access, I knew immediately that it wasn't mine. I've signed my name thousands of times over 72 years. I know how my handwriting looks, especially since my arthritis developed. The signature on that document was too smooth, too perfect. It was a very good forgery, but it wasn't my signature. Jessica's attorney's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. He questioned my memory, my mental state, my motivations for pursuing charges against a family member. He suggested that I was being manipulated by lawyers who stood to profit from a sensational case, and that my accusations were the result of age-related paranoia and confusion. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you've been experiencing memory problems for several months? I occasionally forget small things, like where I put my reading glasses or what I watched on television the night before. I don't forget signing legal documents or giving someone access to my life savings. But you did forget conversations with my client about financial assistance, didn't you? You forgot giving her permission to help manage your accounts. I never gave her permission because those conversations never happened. Your client is a skilled liar who has convinced you and others that her theft was authorized assistance. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is making conclusions about my client's character rather than stating facts. Sustained. Mrs. Patterson, please limit your responses to factual information. The exchange continued for hours, with Jessica's attorney trying to paint me as an unreliable witness whose testimony couldn't be trusted. But I'd been preparing for this moment for months, and I wasn't going to let him intimidate me into backing down from the truth. Michael's testimony was perhaps the most difficult part of the trial. He had to admit publicly that he'd chosen to believe Jessica over me, that he'd dismissed my concerns as paranoia, that he'd been completely fooled by a woman he'd loved and trusted for 8 years. Mr. Patterson, Prosecutor Rivera asked, when did you first begin to doubt your wife's version of events? When my mother called and told me that Emma was in danger, that Jessica was planning to leave the country. At first I thought it was just another paranoid accusation, but something in my mother's voice made me actually listen to what she was saying. What convinced you that your mother was telling the truth? I started paying attention to Jessica's behavior in a way I never had before. When I told her I was taking Emma to visit a friend, she became frantic, almost violent. She said things she'd never said before, revealed attitudes and beliefs that were completely different from the person I thought I'd married. Can you tell the court what she said? Michael's voice broke slightly as he recounted Jessica's threats, her admission that Emma wasn't his biological daughter, her complete transformation from loving wife to cold manipulator when she realized her control was slipped. She told me that I'd ruined everything by believing my crazy mother over her. She said Emma was never really mine anyway, that she'd used her to keep me compliant and that I was too stupid to realize it. She threatened to kill both my mother and me if she ever got the chance. Jessica's attorney tried to minimize Michael's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that he was confused and emotional, that he might have misunderstood what Jessica was saying during a heated argument. But the recording Michael had made of Jessica's threats spoke for itself. The medical testimony was devastating to Jessica's defense. Dr. Patricia Williams, a toxicologist, explained how Digilus worked and how it could be administered without the victim's knowledge. Digilus is derived from the foxglove plant and has been used both medicinally and as a poison for centuries, Dr. Williams testified. In therapeutic doses, it can treat certain heart conditions. In larger doses, it causes exactly the symptoms. Patterson experienced fatigue, nausea, confusion, and eventually heart failure. Could Mrs. Patterson have accidentally poisoned herself with her own heart medication? Absolutely not. Mrs. Patterson was not prescribed Digilus by any of her doctors. The levels we found in her blood could only have come from deliberate administration over a period of several months. Is it possible that herbal supplements could have contained Digilus? While foxglove is sometimes found in unregulated herbal products, the levels and consistency we see here are not consistent with accidental contamination. This was deliberate, systematic poisoning, designed to mimic natural age-related decline. Marcus Thompson's testimony provided crucial context about Jessica's pattern of behavior. He described how she'd insinuated herself into his life, gained access to his business accounts, and systematically stolen from him while maintaining a facade of loving partnership. She was incredibly good at making me feel like I needed her, he testified. She'd create problems and then solve them, making herself indispensable. By the time I realized what she was doing, she'd already stolen over $100,000 and had positioned herself to take everything I'd worked for. Did she ever threaten you when you discovered her theft? She told me that if I pursued charges, she'd claim I'd been abusive, that she'd been stealing the money to escape a violent relationship. She said no one would believe me over a frightened woman with bruises she could easily inflict on herself. The parallels to my own experience were chilling. Jessica had used the same tactics, the same manipulations, the same threats with Marcus that she'd later employed against me. The only difference was that Marcus had caught her before she could complete her plan. When Robert Chen's daughter testified via video link from California, she described a pattern identical to what Jessica had done to Marcus and attempted to do to me. Gradual isolation from family, increasing control over finances, mysterious health problems that seemed to appear suddenly and worsen rapidly. My father was healthy and independent when Jessica entered his life, Linda Chen testified. Within 6 months he was weak, confused and completely dependent on her care. She convinced him to change his will, making her his primary beneficiary, and then he died suddenly of heart failure. Did you suspect foul play at the time? We were suspicious, but Jessica disappeared immediately after the funeral. By the time we could have pursued an investigation, she was gone and the evidence was cold. We always believed she killed our father, but we could never prove it. Jessica's own testimony was a masterclass in manipulation and self-pity. She portrayed herself as a loving daughter-in-law, who'd been trying to help an increasingly difficult elderly woman. She claimed that all her financial assistance had been authorized, that my memory problems had led to confusion about what I'd agreed to, and that the accusations against her were the result of family lawyers looking to create a profitable case. I loved Margaret like my own mother, Jessica testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. When she started showing signs of memory loss, I tried to help her maintain her independence while keeping her safe. I never stole anything from her. I never tried to hurt her. I was just trying to be a good daughter-in-law and granddaughter. But under cross-examination, Jessica's facade began to crack. Prosecutor Rivera methodically went through the evidence, forcing Jessica to explain each forged signature, each unauthorized withdrawal, each inconsistency in her story. Ms. Williams, Prosecutor Rivera began, using Jessica's real name deliberately. You testified that Ms. Patterson gave you permission to access her bank accounts. Can you explain why you felt it was necessary to forge her signature, if you had her permission? I didn't forge anything. Those are legitimate signatures. Are you aware that handwriting experts have testified that these signatures show none of the natural variations consistent with Mrs. Patterson's arthritis-affected handwriting? Handwriting can vary for many reasons: stress, medication, fatigue. Can handwriting vary enough to eliminate tremors caused by a documented medical condition? Jessica paused, realizing she'd been trapped. I don't know. I'm not a handwriting expert. No. But you are an expert at forgery, aren't you? You've done this before with Robert Chen and Marcus Thompson. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making statements, not asking questions. Sustained. Rephrase your question, counselor. Ms. Williams, have you ever forged signatures on financial documents before? No, I have not. Prosecutor Rivera then introduced evidence of the forged documents from Jessica's previous crimes, documents that showed identical techniques and patterns to the forgeries she'd committed against me. Jessica's denials became increasingly desperate and unconvincing as the evidence mounted. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat between Michael and Helen, holding my breath as the foreman stood to announce their decision. On the charge of financial fraud in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of forgery in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Jessica's face went completely white as the reality of her situation hit her. She'd been convicted on all counts and would be facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even in defeat, Jessica couldn't resist one final manipulation. As the bailiff approached to take her into custody, she turned to look directly at me. "I hope you're satisfied, Margaret," she said loudly enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You've destroyed a family over money. Emma will grow up knowing that her grandmother sent her mother to prison. Michael will never forgive you for this." Michael stood up immediately. "No, Jessica, you destroyed our family the moment you decided to lie to us, steal from us, and poison my mother. You're not Emma's mother. You're the woman who used her as a prop in your sick game, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure she knows the difference." As Jessica was led away, I felt a complex mix of emotions: relief that justice had been done, grief for the family that had been shattered by her lies, and hope that Michael, Emma, and I could begin to heal from the trauma she'd inflicted on us. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Jessica's attorney made a final plea for leniency, arguing that she'd suffered childhood trauma that explained her criminal behavior. He painted a picture of a broken woman who deserved sympathy rather than punishment. But Judge Patricia Reeves wasn't buying it. "Ms. Williams, you are not the victim here. You are a calculating predator who has spent years perfecting techniques for exploiting vulnerable people. You didn't steal money on impulse. You systematically planned and executed a campaign of fraud and attempted murder against a woman who welcomed you into her family." Judge Reeves sentenced Jessica to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that her pattern of escalating violence and her lack of remorse made her a continuing danger to society. After the sentencing, Michael, Emma, and I walked out of the courthouse together into bright afternoon sunlight. Emma, who'd been staying with my neighbor Lisa during the trial, ran to meet us on the courthouse steps. "Is it over, Grandma Margaret? Can we go home now?" I knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over. We can go home." But going home meant different things for each of us. For Emma, it meant returning to some version of normal childhood, though she'd be starting therapy to help her process the trauma of learning that the woman she'd called mother had been using her as a tool of manipulation. For Michael, it meant rebuilding his life as a single father, learning to trust his own judgment again after being so thoroughly deceived, and working to repair his relationship with me. For me, it meant returning to my house in Riverside Heights, reclaiming the space that Jessica had violated with her presence, and figuring out how to live with the knowledge that I'd survived an attempted murder by someone I'd loved and trusted. The financial recovery process was surprisingly straightforward. Helen had been tracking Jessica's thefts meticulously, and most of my money was recoverable from accounts Jessica hadn't had time to fully liquidate. The insurance company fought the fraudulent beneficiary change, but eventually restored Michael as my primary beneficiary. More challenging was the emotional recovery. Michael moved back into his old bedroom in my house temporarily while he searched for a place of his own. Emma spent most afternoons with me, and slowly we began to rebuild the family bonds that Jessica had tried to destroy. One evening, as I was preparing dinner while Emma colored at the kitchen table and Michael worked on his laptop in the living room, I realized something important. Jessica had failed completely. Her goal had been to isolate me, steal my assets, and ultimately kill me while positioning herself to inherit everything I'd worked for. Instead, she'd brought my family closer together, taught us to value honesty and trust in ways we'd never appreciated before, and ended up with nothing but a life sentence in prison. Emma looked up from her coloring book. "Grandma Margaret, why did Jessica pretend to love us if she didn't really?" It was a question I'd been dreading, but also one I knew I had to answer honestly. "Some people learn to pretend feelings instead of having real ones, sweetheart. It's like they're acting in a play all the time, never showing their true self. Jessica learned to be very good at acting, but she never learned to actually love people. Will I learn to love people the right way? You already do, Emma. You love honestly and completely, just like your daddy and just like me. That's why Jessica's pretending fooled us. We didn't know that some people could fake love so well because we'd never experienced anything like that before. Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway. Mom, I wanted you to know that I've found an apartment about 10 minutes from here. Emma and I will be moving out next week, but we want to have dinner here every Sunday if that's okay with you. Of course it's okay. This will always be your home, Michael. I also wanted to say thank you for not giving up on us even when I chose to believe Jessica over you, for asking the smart questions that exposed her lies, for saving Emma and me from a woman who would have eventually destroyed us both. As I looked at my son and granddaughter, both of them healing but still bearing the scars of Jessica's manipulation, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment. It had started with me asking supposedly stupid questions about my finances, questions that Jessica had dismissed as the confused concerns of an elderly woman who didn't understand her own business. But those questions had led to smarter questions, which had led to the smartest question of all. What else have you done? That question had revealed Jessica's true nature and saved not just my life, but my family's future. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is refuse to accept simple explanations for complex problems. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is trust your instincts even when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong. And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is ask your attorney one very important question about someone you're supposed to trust. Jessica had been right about one thing. I had been asking stupid questions for months, but she'd been wrong about what happened when I finally started asking smart ones. She'd assumed that an elderly woman wouldn't have the knowledge, resources, or determination to challenge her sophisticated con game. She'd underestimated the power of a grandmother protecting her family, the persistence of a woman who'd spent 72 years learning to recognize truth from lies, and the wisdom that comes from asking the right questions at the right time. As we sat down to dinner that evening, Emma chattering about her day at school and Michael discussing his plans for their new apartment, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The nightmare was over, justice had been served, and my family was safe. Jessica was spending the first night of the rest of her life in a prison cell, finally facing the consequences of her years of manipulation and crime. She'd thought she was smarter than everyone around her, that her victims would be too confused, too trusting, or too afraid to fight back. She'd been wrong about that, just like she'd been wrong about so many other things, and now she had the rest of her life to think about the smart question she should have asked herself before she started this game. What happens when you finally meet someone who's smarter than you are? Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.